In Maine's remote wilderness, 3 women ran what appeared to be a religious sanctuary for over 30 years. 600 women entered seeking spiritual healing. Fewer than half ever returned home. Those who did come back were changed. The Maine State Archives held a survivor's testimony so disturbing that authorities kept it out of public view for more than a century. Tonight we reveal what actually unfolded behind the stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears. Before we go further into the story of the Convent of Eternal Tears, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls willing to uncover the darkest chapters of American history. If you've got the courage to hear what truly happened in the shadows of our past, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Are you bold enough to join our community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out together. What makes this tale especially chilling isn't religious zealotry or supernatural forces, but something more terrifying. A calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human cost. Hidden behind a facade of Christian charity, in the late 18th century, the District of Maine, still part of Massachusetts, was a wilderness territory where scattered communities struggled through brutal winters and harsher realities. Milbridge, a coastal town with barely 300 souls, served as a trading post for lumbermen and fishermen brave enough to face the Atlantic's treacherous waters. 15 miles inland, through dense forest marked only by native hunting trails, lay a parcel of land that would become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The Ashford women arrived in Milbridge on a grey October morning in 1798, their horse-drawn wagon loaded with mysterious crates and medical supplies that drew curious glances from townspeople. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford stepped down with the bearing of European nobility, a striking woman in her early 40s, silver-streaked auburn hair, and penetrating grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. Her voice carried the refined accent of educated English society, and her manner suggested someone long accustomed to command and absolute obedience. Sister Prudence Ashford emerged next. Tall, gaunt, about 30, alabaster skin, and hands moving with the precise grace of a master craftsman. Her fingers, long, pale, and unusually steady, would later prove essential to her gruesome work. Unlike her superior, Prudence rarely spoke, observing the world through pale blue eyes that revealed nothing. When she did, traces of a cultured Scottish accent colored her words, a coolness beneath that unsettled even hardened frontiersmen. The youngest of the trio, novice Temperance Ashford, appeared barely past 22. She possessed a haunting beauty that drew immediate attention, raven black hair, porcelain skin, and dark eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. Yet something in that beauty was unsettling, a quality that made mothers instinctively pull their children closer when she passed. Her smile never reached her eyes, and she had an unnerving habit of studying people as if they were specimens in a collection. The Ashfords claimed to be Anglican nuns fleeing persecution in England, seeking to establish a new order in the American wilderness. They carried impressive letters of recommendation from English church officials, documents later revealed to be masterful forgeries. Their story convinced Milbridge's Protestant community, who viewed educated religious women as a civilizing influence on a rough frontier settlement. With seemingly inexhaustible gold, the sisters purchased nearly 200 acres of remote forest from a grateful widow struggling with her late husband's debts. They paid 3 times the assessed value, raising eyebrows, but securing enthusiastic cooperation from local authorities. Immediately they hired every available carpenter, mason, and laborer to build their religious retreat. The structure that rose over the next 8 months looked unlike any religious building the workers had seen. 3 stories of grey coastal stone, walls thick enough to muffle any sound from within. Windows were unusually small and set high, impossible to see through from ground level. Most peculiar was the basement, requiring deep excavation and reinforced foundations far beyond simple storage. When asked about the unusual design, Mother Superior Agatha answered with a serene smile, "Penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires proper containment." Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is entirely removed from worldly distractions. The explanation satisfied most listeners, though some older workers privately wondered why a house of God needed to resemble a fortress. The Ashfords oversaw every detail with meticulous care, insisting on features that baffled the builders: reinforced doors with heavy locks, drainage able to handle large volumes of liquid, and ventilation shafts more suitable for a medical facility than a convent. When questioned, they cited experience with European institutions, claiming these were standard accommodations for intensive spiritual counseling. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the circuit physician traveling between frontier settlements, became one of their earliest and most enthusiastic supporters. In his 50s and reputed for progressive thinking, Hartwell was immediately impressed by the sisters' apparent knowledge of feminine psychology and mental disorders. At their first meeting, he marveled at their sophisticated grasp of conditions most physicians barely recognized. In his journal, he wrote that the sisters possessed remarkable insight into hysteria and melancholia. Their methods, unconventional though they were, rested on medical principles he feared were decades ahead of America. What Hartwell didn't write in the official journal was the private financial arrangement he struck with Mother Superior Agatha. In exchange for referring difficult cases and providing medical supplies through his connections, he would receive a substantial monthly payment and access to detailed case studies that could advance his career. For a frontier doctor struggling to make ends meet, it was an offer too valuable to refuse. The convent's reputation spread quickly. Families from Portsmouth, Portland, even Boston whispered about the Ashfords' miraculous ability to transform troublesome women into model citizens. The cost was steep: $20 silver for a month, $50 for 3, $100 for what they called complete reformation. But for families facing scandalous daughters or hysterical wives, it seemed a small price for peace and respectability. The women sent there reflected the anxieties of early 19th century America. Unmarried mothers who refused to name their lovers, wives who publicly challenged their husband's authority, daughters rejecting arranged marriages, and women accused of too much interest in books or politics. The common thread was defiance. Women who had stepped outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. Religious tensions contributed as well. Puritan families sent daughters flirting with Anglican or Methodist teachings, while Anglicans disposed of girls drawn to Baptist revival fervor. The Ashfords accepted all denominations with equal enthusiasm, claiming their methods transcended sectarian differences through the universal power of Christian discipline. The first sign that something was fundamentally wrong came on a bitter February night in 1803. Thomas Brewster, a 20-year-old trapper, had been tracking a wounded deer for hours when strange sounds drew him toward the dark stone building looming against the winter sky. He knew the wood's every sound: the crack of ice-laden branches, wolves' distant howls, the whisper of wind through pines. But what he heard was different, unmistakably human, and deeply wrong. Through the heavy, snowy air came screams that rose and fell in waves, dwindling to desperate whimpers before exploding into raw shrieks that froze his blood. Abandoning the deer, Thomas crept closer. From the outside, the building was dark, but at the rear he noticed a faint glow from basement windows, half buried in drifts. The screams grew louder, accompanied by the clink of metal, urgent whispers, and something that sounded disturbingly like sawing. Through a partially frosted pane, he glimpsed a scene that would haunt him forever. The basement converted into a surgical theater, brilliantly lit by oil lamps and candles throwing frantic shadows across stone. A woman lay strapped to a wooden table, head immobilized by a metal apparatus that looked more like torture than medicine. Sister Prudence stood over the restrained woman, her pale face flushed with concentration as she manipulated a long, thin metal rod. The patient's head was partially shaved, pale scalp marked with dark inked lines. Most horrifying of all, there was an opening in the skull. Thomas could see the gleam of exposed bone, and beneath it, darker matter he realized with sick horror was brain tissue. The woman's eyes were wide with terror and pain, and worse than the screams was the clinical detachment of her keepers. Mother Superior Agatha calmly recording observations in a notebook, novice Temperance passing instruments with the practiced efficiency of an experienced assistant. Thomas watched, frozen as Prudence inserted the rod deeper. The screaming reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the stones, then abruptly stopped as the patient lost consciousness. The sisters continued working with methodical precision, untroubled by her lack of response. Thomas fled into the night, stumbling through drifts in blind panic. The image burned into his memory. The casual efficiency, the scientific detachment, and the horrifying realization this was not the first time. At dawn, he burst into his father's blacksmith shop, raving about torture and brain surgery with such frenzy that his father feared a breakdown. The elder Brewster, practical and protective of community stability, listened with growing alarm as his son described scenes more suited to Gothic fiction than a respectable religious institution. He cautioned that the mind can play tricks when hunting alone in a blizzard after hours of tracking a wounded animal. Perhaps it had been some sort of medical procedure. The sisters were known to treat feminine ailments requiring intimate intervention, but Thomas's account was too precise. The basement's layout, the instruments, and most convincingly, the clinical, practiced method. The elder Brewster consulted Deacon Morrison, the town's most respected citizen and unofficial moral authority. A cautious man devoted to community harmony, Morrison noted that the Ashfords had been model citizens for 5 years, generous donors with impeccable decorum, and several prominent families had wives and daughters in their care. "We must be cautious," he warned. Accusations like these could destroy reputations and tear the community apart. Surely there was a reasonable explanation for what the boy believed he saw. Still, he agreed to discreetly inquire, visiting the convent under the pretense of discussing a church fundraiser. Mother Superior Agatha received him in an austere parlor, dominated by a large crucifix and watchful religious paintings. Perfectly gracious and composed, she poured tea and asked after his family with apparent sincerity. When Morrison mentioned Hunter's hearing unusual night noises, she showed only mild concern. "Intensive prayer sessions for the most troubled residents often took place at night," she explained. "Spiritual cleansing could be quite vocal, especially for women sunk in sin and moral corruption. Many arrived in severe spiritual distress, possessed by pride, lust, and rebellion, fighting against the purifying power of Christian discipline. The cries heard outside were likely demons being cast out through prayer and penance." Her theological poise and sincerity left Morrison nodding. Spiritual warfare was familiar to frontier Christians, and within that frame, extreme measures didn't seem unreasonable. Agatha then toured him through the upper levels, Spartan but clean dormitories where women sat in silent contemplation. They appeared calm and absorbed in prayer, though Morrison noticed an unnatural uniformity. Movements too controlled, too mechanical. Attempts to meet their eyes found them gazing past him, focused on something invisible. When he asked about the basement, Agatha said those levels housed intensive spiritual counseling for women requiring the most focused attention. "It would be inappropriate for a man to witness such intimate procedures," she added with a modest smile. Some treatments for feminine spiritual corruption required private examination of the soul that would compromise a patient's dignity if seen by male eyes. Within social norms, the explanation felt reasonable, and Morrison left reassured, yet troubled by a subtle wrongness he couldn't shake. The women were too quiet, too controlled like sleepwalkers, and there was a smell throughout the building beyond medicine and cleaning solutions, evoking battlefield hospitals from the Revolution, the clinging stench of blood and suffering. After Morrison's visit, the sisters tightened security. The nighttime screaming ceased, replaced by an eerie silence even more ominous. Families continued sending their troubled women. The sisters continued accepting them with increasingly sophisticated promises of transformation. Observant residents, however, noticed disturbing patterns. Women who went in for spiritual correction emerged months later as entirely different people, not redeemed, but fundamentally altered. Mary Prescott had been a spirited 19-year-old, known for quick wit, infectious laughter, and stubborn independence, scandalizing her family by refusing 3 suitable proposals. Sent for 6 months of spiritual guidance to prepare for proper married life, she returned transformed. At first her parents were delighted. No more arguments over chores or doctrine. In her place stood a docile, blank-eyed woman who spoke only when addressed and expressed no preferences. She accepted the first proposal with mechanical compliance, feeling nothing for the match. Weeks later, worry replaced relief. Mary failed to recognize favorite foods, cherished possessions, or childhood friends. Shown letters she had written before treatment, she stared as if they belonged to a stranger. Most disturbing, she showed no emotion, no joy or sorrow, no pleasure or pain. Dr. Hartwell praised the sisters' work as a complete success. The defects that made her unsuitable for marriage and motherhood had been eliminated through proper spiritual discipline. But Mary's mother noticed patterned scars on her scalp, partly hidden by hair, too deliberate to be accidental. Mary remembered nothing of the convent, only that she had prayed very hard to become a better woman. Similar cases multiplied. Hannah Morse, treated for melancholia after her infant's death, returned after 3 months unnaturally cheerful, claiming she had never had a child. Shown the baby's clothes and toys, she displayed no recognition, as if that part of her life had been erased. Elizabeth Thornton's case was worst. Committed for hysteria after accusing her husband of adultery and demanding a divorce. Behavior that threatened both families. Standing, she came back 4 months later retracting everything, insisting she had never spoken those accusations. She remembered none of the events leading to her commitment, now describing her marriage as perfectly happy and her husband beyond reproach. She suffered severe headaches, confusion about basic information, forgetting old friends' names, getting lost in familiar streets and struggling with once simple tasks. Like others, she bore mysterious scalp scars and no memory of their origin. Hartwell kept endorsing the methods even as he himself unraveled, drinking heavily and rambling about advancing science and necessary sacrifices for the greater good. His private journal, found after his death, revealed a man wrestling with conscience while rationalizing horrors. The procedures he witnessed violated every principle of medical ethics, yet the results were undeniable. Altered personalities, suppressed memories, modified behavior through direct surgical intervention. The sisters' documentation was meticulous, their methodology sound, results consistent and reproducible. History would determine whether they were pioneers or monsters. Correspondence between the convent and European institutions surged. Postal workers, generously paid for silence, noticed the volume of foreign-bound packages and letters. The sisters received medical text, surgical instruments, chemical compounds. They sent detailed reports and what looked like preserved biological specimens. Agatha made monthly trips to Portland and Boston, returning with carefully handled crates. Explaining the convent was pioneering revolutionary treatments for feminine mental disorders by combining spiritual healing with European science. Her cultured manner and education made the story plausible to a community that valued both faith and progress. Yet suspicion grew. Martha Goodwin, whose daughter Rebecca returned fundamentally altered, began quietly questioning other families. A pattern emerged. None of the women who received intensive basement treatment remembered anything, except fragments of prayer and instruction. Martha discovered another troubling fact: some women had never returned. Families who asked about missing daughters or wives were told these women had experienced profound spiritual awakening and chosen to remain as permanent residents dedicated to prayer and service. Requests to visit were politely refused. The supposed residents had taken strict vows of silence and seclusion, forbidding contact with their former lives. The mystery deepened when Martha learned that distant, wealthy families from New York, Philadelphia, even Charleston, were sending problematic daughters to remote Maine, paying large sums and traveling great distances for promised complete transformation. Fees rose accordingly, up to $500 for comprehensive reformation over 6 months, guaranteeing permanent elimination of undesirable traits. By its second decade, the convent and the Ashfords were recognized as authorities on feminine mental disorders by medical communities in America and Europe. Their reputation drew prominent physicians, fascinated by detailed case studies and remarkable success rates. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School became one of their most dedicated correspondents for over 15 years. In letters preserved at Harvard, he expressed amazement at their sophistication. Their documentation of behavioral modification surpassed anything in contemporary Europe. The precision correlating specific physical interventions with predictable personality changes suggested a level of understanding the profession wouldn't reach for decades. He did not realize he was reading clinical descriptions of early lobotomy, trepanation, and systematic brain damage. The sisters had developed advanced knowledge of cranial anatomy and brain function through years of unrestricted human experimentation, insight legitimate researchers could only theorize. From animal studies and post-mortems, their research methodology was disturbingly thorough. Detailed records of each patient's personality and behavior pre-treatment, precise documentation of every experimental step, and post-treatment observations tracking memory, personality, cognition, and behavior with scientific rigor. Surgical techniques evolved markedly. Sister Prudence became adept at targeted cranial intervention, accessing specific brain regions through carefully calculated entry points. Her anatomical drawings, discovered decades later, mapped approaches to different structures with exact measurements and angles. Procedures were conducted with chilling detachment. Patients were sedated with laudanum or other opiates, but not fully unconscious. Subjects needed to remain responsive so the sisters could monitor real-time effects while manipulating brain regions. They asked questions, issued commands, and observed behavioral changes as instruments probed tissue. Temperance grew into the expert on psychological conditioning and behavioral reconstruction, creating elaborate protocols to reinforce surgical outcomes through rewards and punishments, sensory manipulation, and psychological pressure. She used controlled nutrition, sleep deprivation, temperature extremes, and social isolation to break down existing personalities and rebuild them to specification. They also pioneered chemical adjuncts, obtaining substances through contacts long before mainstream availability. They experimented with combinations, documenting effects on consciousness, memory, and susceptibility to manipulation with the same systematic rigor as their surgical work. By 1815, more than 400 women had been processed through various programs. Success rates exceeded 90%. By their definition, complete elimination of whatever traits had prompted commitment. Those who died were recorded as failures. Their bodies were preserved for further study. Operations expanded dramatically. They began accepting so-called research volunteers, destitute women without family ties, offered food, shelter, and modest compensation to participate in experiments, advancing understanding of the feminine mind. Prostitutes, vagrants, widows with no means, these women became subjects for the most experimental procedures. Documentation later found in hidden convent archives revealed precise skull measurements, detailed brain tissue reactions to stimuli, and careful observations linking interventions to behavioral changes. Extensive correspondence with researchers across Europe and America revealed a thriving black market in human experimentation data, with the Ashfords as primary suppliers of information unobtainable by ethical means. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna became a lucrative customer, paying substantial sums for detailed documentation on personality modification through surgery. His letters, later intercepted, requested techniques for erasing specific memories, reducing emotional responsiveness, and creating compliant behavioral states in female subjects. The University of Edinburgh, ironically the same institution that had expelled Dr. Agatha Brennan, unknowingly purchased data through intermediaries who concealed its origin, incorporating the findings into curricula that taught techniques and theories grounded in systematic human experimentation in the Maine wilderness. Perhaps most chilling, the sisters accepted commissions for specific behavioral modifications. Wealthy families requested targeted changes, eliminating artistic inclinations, reducing intellectual curiosity, suppressing romantic attachments, or creating perfect domestic compliance. The sisters developed specialized procedures for each, charging premium prices. The careful facade shielding the Ashfords for nearly 2 decades began to crack in the winter of 1818, when Sarah Whitman arrived under circumstances that would become their undoing. Unlike the broken, desperate women who usually came, Sarah arrived a fighter, intelligent, strong-willed, and unbroken by social pressure. Her offense, bearing a child out of wedlock and refusing to name the father, despite months of pressure from her wealthy Boston family. Her parents, prominent merchants, attempted a discreet marriage or adoption to preserve honor. Sarah refused both, insisting on keeping her child and living independently. They declared her unstable and arranged her commitment to the Convent of Eternal Tears. At 24, Sarah possessed a formidable intellect, nurtured by progressive parents until her pregnancy made her an embarrassment. She had received an unusually comprehensive education for a woman of her era, including exposure to medical texts through her father's physician contacts, knowledge that proved crucial in recognizing the true nature of the Ashfords' activities. From the moment she arrived, she knew the convent wasn't what it seemed. Residents moved with mechanical precision. Responses were unnaturally controlled. Eyes disturbingly vacant. Many bore visible scalp scars, hair regrown over surgical sites. Several displayed clear signs of brain damage. Speech difficulties, memory lapses, personality shifts so dramatic they seemed entirely different people. Sarah knew these symptoms as the results of deliberate surgical intervention. During her first week, she underwent the same preliminaries that preceded intensive treatment. Detailed skull measurements, exhaustive questioning about personality and behavior, and physical tests designed more to map neurological responses than to assess spiritual condition. The Ashfords were puzzled by her resistance. Most patients, already broken by shame and rejection, submitted quickly. Sarah maintained defiance even under harsher conditioning, solitary confinement for days, inadequate food and water, and hours of psychological abuse intended to dismantle her sense of self-worth. Temperance deployed every technique in her arsenal: sensory deprivation, temperature extremes, sleep disruption, and relentless verbal assault. Sarah stayed alert, determined to escape, mentally mapping the convent, memorizing routines, and recording observations in a makeshift journal written on scraps with berry juice, hidden in her clothing seams. Her breakthrough came during a violent thunderstorm in March 1819, when basement flooding disrupted operations. Forced to move equipment and patients upstairs, the sisters created confusion that gave Sarah a chance. She slipped away, exploring forbidden areas. What she found in the basement exceeded her worst fears: operating tables with total restraints, collections of instruments unlike anything in conventional medicine, and, most horrifying, jars of preserved human brain tissue, each labeled with patient names, dates, and procedural notes. Surgical records documented deliberate brain damage with scientific precision. Systematic removal of tissue from specific regions, with observations on resulting changes in personality, memory, and behavior. Some entries included detailed skull sketches and anatomical diagrams pinpointing intervention sites. Most damning correspondence files contained letters from European physicians purchasing the sisters' data for substantial sums. Discussing results and specimens with casual indifference, it was clear the convent functioned as a business enterprise, selling human experimentation, results to researchers unwilling or unable to conduct such studies themselves. Armed with this knowledge and samples of documentation concealed on her person, Sarah planned her escape with desperate urgency. She knew intensive treatment was days away and understood it would likely leave her as damaged as the others. Time was closing in. The sisters were becoming suspicious of her resistance. On a moonless night in early April 1819, she overpowered a guard and fled into the forest. The Ashfords organized an immediate, massive search. They knew Sarah held information that could destroy their carefully constructed facade and expose decades of criminal activity. For 3 harrowing days she evaded capture, moving through the wilderness toward the nearest settlement, surviving on spring water and wild edibles she could identify. The pursuit was relentless and well organized. The sisters knew the terrain and had the resources to mount a comprehensive manhunt, even hiring local men under the pretense of searching for a mentally disturbed woman who might harm herself. Sarah heard their calls echo through the forest as they combed every hiding place. On the second night, she nearly blundered into a search party while seeking shelter from sudden rain, avoiding detection only through quick thinking and woodcraft learned during childhood visits to her grandfather's logging camp. She spent the night hidden in a fallen tree while they searched nearby. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss tales like this. Let's discover together what happens when Sarah reaches civilization and the shocking truth begins to unravel. By the third day, her condition deteriorated rapidly, dehydrated, exhausted, suffering from exposure to harsh April weather, feet bleeding from rough terrain, early hypothermia setting in. Yet her determination to reach safety and expose the sisters drove her forward. The breakthrough came when she encountered Joshua Meadows, a trapper checking his lines in the early morning. Initially wary of a wild-looking woman emerging from the woods, Joshua changed his mind as Sarah described specific details about the convent only an insider would know. Her desperation was real, her injuries obvious, and her story too consistent to be madness. He provided food, warm clothing, and most importantly, safe passage to Sheriff William Hawthorne in Milbridge. Even as they traveled, Sarah remained terrified. The Ashfords would catch her before she could tell authorities. She knew their resources and connections extended far beyond their isolated compound. When Sarah reached the sheriff's office on April 18, 1819, her appearance and claims met the same skepticism that had greeted Thomas Brewster 16 years earlier. The level-headed sheriff assumed another victim of exposure and mental collapse. Systematic human experimentation sounded too fantastical, too horrific to be real. But her testimony differed in crucial ways. Her detailed knowledge of the interior layout matched facts, never made public. Specific basement chambers, equipment, arrangements, and hidden storage known only to someone with deep access. More importantly, she had stolen documents, surgical notes, correspondence with European institutions, and patient records, clinical language describing acts that would be war crimes today, leaving no doubt about the systematic nature of the horrors. The first document was a surgical log covering 23 women over 8 months. Entries written with scientific precision. Operations involved drilling skulls and inserting implements to damage or remove specific brain tissues. Each entry included preoperative personality assessments, exact surgical steps, and post-operative observations tracking changes in behavior, memory, and cognition. One chilling case described Margaret Fowler, 19, committed for excessive reading and intellectual curiosity, inappropriate to her sex. The notes detailed a procedure intended to damage regions associated with learning and memory, stated, "Goal: reduce compulsive interest in books and abstract thought while preserving basic domestic skills." Post-operative observations recorded horrific success. Love of reading extinguished, vocabulary drastically reduced, complex reasoning severely impaired. The file concluded with satisfaction that the patient now displayed appropriate feminine docility and no interest beyond household tasks. The second file was even more damning, correspondence from Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna, negotiating purchase of cranial intervention data for 4,000 Austrian florins, specifically requesting techniques to eliminate undesired memories and personality traits through surgical modification. His letters revealed an international network buying human experimentation data from the Ashfords, universities in Edinburgh, Berlin, and Paris, receiving regular reports detailing results that any civilized legal system would ban. The sisters were operating as commercial suppliers of information legitimate researchers could not ethically obtain. The third document horrified most, a patient catalog listing more than 600 women processed since 1798, organized by treatment type, with annotations describing procedures and ultimate disposition. Most entries read, reformed and returned, women who underwent surgical modification and went back to families with altered personalities. A smaller number were permanent residents, supposedly choosing to remain, though their whereabouts were unspecified. Most troubling, nearly 200 entries were marked expired, women who died during or soon after experimental procedures. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, Sheriff Hawthorne organized a raid, assembling 15 armed men and sending urgent messages to authorities in Portland and Boston requesting federal marshals. But the Ashfords had informants in Milbridge. When the raiding party reached the convent on the morning of May 20th, 1819, the building was abandoned. The sisters had vanished in the night, taking most portable equipment and documentation, leaving behind only what they could not move. The search revealed a chamber of horrors that traumatized even the hardiest men. The basement contained a fully equipped surgical theater with instruments designed specifically for cranial procedures. Shelves lined the walls with hundreds of preserved brain specimens, each labeled with patient details and experiments performed. A hidden chamber behind a false wall held 47 bodies in varying states of preservation, all showing evidence of cranial surgery, maintained in alcohol and other chemicals for ongoing study, each tagged with procedures and results before death. Investigators found extensive documentation left behind in haste. Thousands of pages of surgical notes, patient records, and correspondence with medical institutions worldwide. The scope was staggering, more than 2 decades of systematic human experimentation, documenting procedures mainstream medicine wouldn't recognize for decades. When confronted with proof of his complicity, Dr. Hartwell at first tried to justify himself, claiming he was advancing medical science for humanity's benefit. These women were already lost to society, he argued. Their conditions made them unfit for normal life. At least their suffering contributed to knowledge that would help future generations. Faced with evidence of systematic murder disguised as treatment, he appeared to suffer a complete mental breakdown. In a final confession under guard in the Milbridge jail, he revealed the sisters' true identities and criminal backgrounds. The women known as Mother Superior Agatha, Sister Prudence, and Novice Temperance Ashford were actually Dr. Agatha Brennan, Dr. Prudence Ashford, and Dr. Temperance Ashford, trained physicians expelled from European institutions for unauthorized human experiments. Brennan had been banned from practice in Scotland after patients died during procedures meant to correct hysteria via surgery. Prudence was dismissed from the University of Edinburgh Medical School for illegal experiments on asylum patients, mapping brain function by systematically damaging different regions. Temperance, the youngest, had been her sister's student, developing psychological conditioning techniques to enhance surgical effects. They fled Europe in 1797 and adopted false identities as Anglican nuns to continue research far from oversight or legal constraint. For over 20 years, they perfected techniques for modifying behavior through surgical intervention, gathering knowledge legitimate researchers could only dream about. The manhunt for the escaped Ashfords became one of early America's most extensive criminal investigations involving federal marshals, local sheriffs, and international cooperation with European authorities. But the 3 vanished completely, leaving only the horrific evidence of 2 decades of human experimentation. Investigators learned the sisters had maintained multiple escape routes and amassed substantial wealth. Bank records showed enormous sums transferred to accounts in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries, over $50,000, a fortune worth millions today. They had established false identities and safe houses throughout North America and Europe, suggesting they had planned their exit from the start. Shipping records indicated they had been moving equipment and documentation out for months before Sarah's escape, preparing for exposure. The probe revealed the full scope of their crimes. Over 21 years, the Ashfords processed more than 600 women. About 250 were returned to families as successfully treated, all showing signs of brain damage consistent with surgical intervention. Another 50 were listed as choosing to remain as permanent residents, though no trace of them was ever found. Investigators concluded they were likely murdered, preserved for study, and disposed of when no longer useful. The remaining 200 were found in various states of preservation within hidden chambers, patients who died during procedures or were deliberately killed when their responses provided valuable data. The systematic preservation suggested comparative study over long periods. Evidence also exposed a wide network of collaborators across medical and academic circles. Hartwell was only one of several physicians who referred patients and supplied materials in exchange for access to results. Postal workers, suppliers, and some local officials were paid to maintain secrecy. Universities across America and Europe unknowingly incorporated Ashford research into curricula, teaching techniques and theories rooted in systematic human experimentation conducted in Maine. The discovery forced a painful re-examination of where medical knowledge came from and the profession's ethical standards. Families of victims faced an agonizing choice: seek justice and endure scandal, or protect their reputations. Most chose silence, living with private grief rather than public shame. That silence ensured the full extent of the Ashfords' crimes was never officially acknowledged. The investigation was quietly closed after 6 months, with most evidence sealed in government archives for more than a century. The official record reduced the scandal to 3 women operating a fraudulent facility who fled justice, leaving evidence of irregular methods. Locals eventually burned the convent to erase every trace. Yet the sisters' extensive documentation survived and eventually reached medical institutions around the world. Ironically, research extracted through horror contributed to legitimate advances in understanding brain function and psychological disorders. Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor who escaped and exposed the truth, struggled with trauma for years. She spent months testifying and helping identify victims. The emotional toll was devastating. As the only person willing to speak publicly, she found herself isolated by a society that preferred to forget. She moved to California under an assumed name, worked as a teacher, never married, and kept minimal contact with her embarrassed family. Her detailed memoir, written shortly before her death in 1863, became the most complete account of life inside the Convent of Eternal Tears and a crucial historical record of the sisters' crimes. The Ashfords were never captured. Unconfirmed reports placed them across the Americas and Europe for decades. Some believed they continued their work under new identities. Others suggested associates killed them to eliminate witnesses. A reported 1847 sighting in Argentina described 3 elderly women operating a private medical facility for the wealthy, but the inquiry proved inconclusive. The most credible account came from a French physician who claimed to have met Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris in 1856. According to his report, she worked under an assumed name as a private physician specializing in women's nervous disorders, using techniques suspiciously similar to those documented in Maine. When authorities investigated, she had already disappeared, leaving only tantalizing hints of her identity. The Convent of Eternal Tears stands as one of the most systematic, prolonged episodes of human experimentation in American history. The Ashfords combined scientific methodology with total moral bankruptcy, advancing medical knowledge while destroying hundreds of lives. Their meticulous documentation revealed techniques and insights not recognized by mainstream medicine for decades, at an incalculable human cost. The case exposed the vulnerability of women in early America, where social pressures and legal constraints enabled 3 criminals to operate with impunity for over 2 decades. The systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable, justified by claims of medical progress and social benefit, shows how easily noble intentions can mask horrific crimes. Perhaps most disturbing, the conspiracy of silence afterward revealed society's willingness to suppress uncomfortable truths rather than confront systemic abuse. Families, institutions, and officials who chose secrecy over justice ensured that victims' suffering would be forgotten, and that similar crimes might happen again. This mystery reveals the terrifying potential of unchecked scientific ambition combined with prejudice against the vulnerable. The fact that 3 women could run a systematic program of human experimentation for over 20 years with tacit support from professionals and community leaders shows how dangerous knowledge becomes when pursued without ethical restraints. What do you think of this story? Could such systematic horrors really have remained hidden for so long in early American society? The evidence suggests that the pursuit of knowledge, divorced from compassion and responsibility, can lead to atrocities that challenge our idea of civilized behavior. Do you believe similar crimes could occur today, hidden behind facades of respectability and scientific progress? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this chilling chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves unearthing the buried secrets of our past. The shadows of history hold many more truths powerful people tried to erase forever. See you in the next video, where we'll reveal another dark secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about American.